Waiting for the Barbarians is a novel by J. M. Coetzee, published in 1980. The title of the novel is taken from a poem of the same name, Waiting for the Barbarians, by a Greek poet called Constantine P. Cavafy. It is from the close first-person perspective of an unnamed magistrate who is also an unreliable narrator. The novel is set in an unspecified historical time period in a fictional, unnamed country that resembles apartheid South Africa and at times the Roman or medieval era. Waiting for the Barbarians' postmodern fiction and contemporary novel covers the literary anti-apartheid movement as it is a torture novel and a political allegory for colonial violence, imperial paranoia, power, and the psychological burden of white guilt. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Before we summarize the novel, let's check its historical background. In 1976, 5 years before Waiting for the Barbarians was published, the Soweto uprising marked a pivotal moment in South Africa's anti-apartheid movement. Around 15,000, 20,000 schoolchildren from Southwest townships protested against an education policy that required lessons to be taught in Afrikaans, the language of Dutch settlers. This policy was especially harmful because most students and teachers didn't speak Afrikaans fluently, making learning even more difficult. Although the protests started peacefully, police opened fire on the students, killing at least 176 people in the first week. Over the following weeks, protests spread to 160 black townships across the country. In total, 14,000 students went into exile and joined the resistance movement Umkhonto we Sizwe to fight against the apartheid regime. The 1970s also saw the rise of the Black Consciousness movement, a response to the racist policies of the apartheid-enforcing National Party. This movement, led by activists like Steve Biko, emphasized psychological and physical liberation for Black South Africans from the social, political, and economic oppression they faced. Biko, a prominent leader, was arrested in 1977 and died in detention after enduring brutal torture. Officials claimed he hit his head in a scuffle, but it was later revealed that his death was due to extreme abuse, echoing Colonel Jall's excuse for the Barbarian girl's father's death in the novel. The fear-driven oppression and demonization of the other in apartheid South Africa mirrors the themes in Waiting for the Barbarians, where the empire uses the same tactics to justify control and violence. Waiting for the Barbarians begins with the magistrate encountering Colonel Jall, a menacing figure from the empire's secret police, known as the Third Bureau. Jall is convinced that the Barbarians are organizing an attack on the frontier areas and travels a great distance from the capital to investigate. Doubting if there is any real threat, the magistrate has lived peacefully at the outpost for many years, trading with the nomads Jall considers enemies. Jall sets off on a mission to capture Barbarians and returns with a group of fisherfolk and nomads who belong to a different tribe than the Barbarians and are innocent. Disturbed by the situation, the magistrate chooses to look away and ignore the screams of the prisoners as Jall tortures them in the barracks. The magistrate briefly challenges Jall's methods, questioning the use of torture to extract the truth. But Jall cryptically hints that his pursuit is of a truth far removed from what the magistrate understands. Jall's sadistic enjoyment unsettles the magistrate, who longs to return to the quiet life he led before. He avoids confronting the reality of the empire's brutality and instead distracts himself by spending time at the local inn with a young, bird-like woman. Jall eventually leaves to file his report, and the prisoners are released. The magistrate is shaken when he sees their devastated, broken bodies and imagines them as beyond hope or recovery. Gradually, most of the prisoners leave, except for one, a blind girl with shattered ankles who begs on the streets. The magistrate takes her into his home, feeling an inexplicable need to care for her. He begins by washing her injured feet and eventually her entire body. This act becomes a mix of compassion and confused desire, which he does not fully understand. Though he feels no sexual attraction to her, he is compelled by an undefined urge to cleanse her. He struggles to reconcile her scars and the horrors she has endured with the person she was before her torture. The girl stays in his room, but she remains silent about her past despite his urging. Eventually, she reveals how the torturers blinded her, used cruel instruments on her body, and killed her father in front of her. The magistrate feels revulsion, though he cannot pinpoint why. He begins to avoid her, returning instead to the young woman at the inn. When the girl asks why he rejects her, he has no answer. Despite her gestures of wanting to stay, he puts her out of his room, oblivious to the emotional pain he is causing her. Overwhelmed by guilt and confusion, the magistrate decides to return her to her people. The magistrate sets off with the girl, 2 soldiers and a guide on a grueling journey across the desert. They lose horses and run out of water. Along the way, he begins to admire her resilience, surpassing even the men's. They eventually become intimate. The magistrate starts to believe he might be falling in love with her. When they finally locate a group of nomads, he asks the girl to return with him to the outpost, but she declines. They part ways, and she rides off with her people. Upon returning to the outpost, the magistrate is accused of treason by a member of the 3rd Bureau and imprisoned in the same barracks where Jal's prisoners were tortured. Initially, he feels a strange solidarity with the girl, imagining her suffering as he endures confinement. His body deteriorates, and he stinks of filth. Soldiers capture more barbarians, who are tortured publicly in the town square. Even children are encouraged to participate in the abuse. Jal leads the barbaric spectacle, taunting the prisoners, while the magistrate protests and is beaten in front of the crowd before being thrown back into his cell. Jal interrogates the magistrate, who openly condemns him. The magistrate is tortured, but the details are left vague. When Jal leaves with more soldiers, he places the magistrate under the control of a cruel officer, Mandel. Mandel subjects the magistrate to further humiliation, such as torturing him naked in front of the townsfolk, forcing him to wear a dress and hanging him from a tree until his shoulders dislocated. The magistrate survives and starts to beg in the town. As time passes, the magistrate begins to recover and notices that some townspeople still respect him. He learns that the barbarians have flooded the fields, forcing many residents to abandon the outpost and return to the capital. Mandel and his soldiers terrorize those who remain, but eventually Mandel and most of his men leave. Winter approaches, and the magistrate regains a sense of leadership in his old home. He organizes the remaining townspeople to grow food within the walls and gather supplies for the harsh season. One night, Jal returns with a handful of terrified soldiers, having been lured into the desert by the elusive barbarians. They starved, were picked off, and fled without ever engaging in a battle. The magistrate informs Jal that he had brought evil upon himself. Defeated, Jal and his men quickly leave at night, with a few remaining people and 3 soldiers, bracing for winter and a possible attack by the barbarians. As the first snow falls, he reflects on his life and wonders if he lost his way long ago. Let's discuss the important themes of the Waiting for the Barbarians by J.M. Coetzee. In Waiting for the Barbarians, the empire symbolizes imperial power in a broad, abstract sense. It is intentionally left unnamed, distancing it from any specific real-world nation. The people living in the frontier settlement under the magistrate irrationally fear and despise the barbarians, who live in the surrounding desert. This fear is not based on actual encounters but instead stems from superstition, ignorance, and military propaganda. Soldiers and leaders like Colonel Jal blindly follow orders, convinced that the barbarians are inherently evil and a threat to the empire. This dehumanization justifies their torture and murder in the eyes of both the military and civilians. The townspeople, while occasionally trading with the nomads, still stereotype them as lazy, dirty, and inferior, viewing them as fundamentally different and uncivilized compared to the empire's supposed superiority. By treating the barbarians as the other, alien, incomprehensible, and subhuman, the empire uses this narrative to justify its violent expansion and domination. The novel subtly critiques historical events like South African apartheid, where black citizens were displaced from white-dominated areas to designated outlying provinces. Coetzee draws a parallel between the empire's treatment of the barbarians and South Africa's systematic oppression, where indigenous African people were expelled from their own land by Dutch and British colonial powers. This displacement and dehumanization of the other reflects how imperialist ideologies often rely on creating an enemy to rationalize violence and control. The empire's need to glorify itself mirrors broader imperialist narratives of superiority and righteousness, which serve to justify its destructive actions. Colonialism, as portrayed in the novel, is not just a cultural or ideological process but a violent physical one, leaving deep scars on both the land and the bodies of those colonized. The novel highlights how fear of the other can consume an entire society, enabling atrocities and granting a false sense of entitlement to the violence inflicted in territories claimed. Through the lens of the empire's paranoia and oppression, Coetzee critiques imperialism and the lasting harm it causes, drawing direct parallels to the injustices of apartheid. The empire's violent dominance over vulnerable groups is portrayed through characters like Colonel Jal, Mandel, and the guards, all of whom are white men. This dominance begins with the colonization of barbarian land and continues through the brutal imprisonment, interrogation, and torture of the indigenous people, labeled as barbarians in the novel. The empire's power is closely tied to traditionally masculine activities, such as hunting and womanizing. For example, when the magistrate first meets Colonel Jal boasts about a hunting trip so excessive that a mountain of carcasses had to be left to rot. On the other hand, the magistrate fails to kill his prey during a hunting trip in Chapter 2, symbolizing his diminished masculinity and lack of dominance. Similarly, when the magistrate encounters Mandel in Chapter 4, he imagines him as a boastful womanizer who flaunts his strength and craves admiration. By comparison, the magistrate struggles with sexual performance, and his sense of masculinity is further stripped away during Mandel's torture, particularly in the scene where he is humiliated by being dressed in women's clothing and hanged in a mock execution. This theme of dominance is also reflected in the novel's frequent references to animal cruelty. Animals symbolize the oppressed, fish represent the fisherfolk, lambs symbolize the nomadic prisoners, and dogs represent the magistrate after he is brutalized. The novel is deeply focused on exploring male sexuality, particularly that of the magistrate. His sexuality is tied to his socialized sense of power and self-worth. When he holds authority, his sexual desire flourishes, but as his power fades, so does his libido. As he begins questioning his existence and place in the empire, his desire becomes increasingly troubled. However, during his trek into the wilderness, away from the confines of his society, he experiences the least inhibition. In contrast, the barbarian girl's sexuality remains largely enigmatic. The novel primarily examines the magistrate's distinctly male perspective on sexuality, which is closely intertwined with his identity, power, and internal struggles. The nomadic girl's torture robbed her of her innocence and drastically changed her life. As the magistrate observes, she will never be courted and married in the normal way. Despite her suffering, the girl claims she can still see. However, her vision has been permanently altered. She must crane her neck and rely on her peripheral vision to glimpse the world at the edges. Her literal and metaphorical blindness means she will never view the world the same way again. This idea also applies to the magistrate, who experiences his own transformative moment during his torture. As he is flogged, he cries out, "I am blind." This temporary blindness forces him to confront the empire's brutality and reject the ideals he once served. Perhaps, his blindness represents his long-standing denial, his inability to face the empire's cruelty and its consequences fully. The magistrate is both captivated and unsettled by the girl's blindness, which is a direct result of the empire's violence. Yet, he struggles to see her as she is now, unable to reconcile her scarred, damaged present with the person she was before. This inability reflects his denial and his refusal to confront the full reality of the empire's atrocities. While the girl insists she can still see, albeit indirectly, the magistrate's blindness occurs when he looks directly at her and attempts to see her for who she is. His obsession with remembering her as she once was feels like a futile effort to erase or undo the harm inflicted on her, a reality he remains blind to accepting. Colonel Jal's altered vision also symbolizes blindness, but his is self-inflicted. His ever-present dark sunglasses reflect his detachment from the humanity of those he tortures. However, at the novel's end, when Jal is humiliated and abandoned, his naked face is revealed as he removes his dark lenses. This removal symbolizes his realization that his violent methods have failed, and the empire he serves is crumbling around him.